Welcome to the Hermit's Lamp podcast. That musical intro was made by my daughter Claire. I appreciate deeply that her arrhythmic sense of tunes matches so deeply my own, even though we don't actually talk about the music and how she's going to make it. I simply gave her a free license to make something that she thought would be interesting to play at the opening of the podcast. Speaking of the podcast, I really would like to thank everybody who supports the Patreon. It makes transcriptions possible. It makes the fact that I'm going to be acquiring some new recording hardware in the next month possible. And it also facilitates me continuing to prioritize this project because, as you might imagine, I have a lot on the go. It allows me to continue to prioritize what amounts to basically a whole workday of my month set aside for this project. If you have been enjoying this podcast and all 92 episodes before this one, if you think accessibility is important as I do, then you can support the transcription process as well as continue to support me in providing this podcast to the world. Jump on over to patreon.com/thehermitslamp. Every little bit helps. Welcome to the Hermit's Lamp podcast, episode 93. I am here with Rebecca Beyer, who is herbalist and plant person and does all sorts of wonderful things in that environment. For those who don't know you, Rebecca, give us a quick introduction. Who are you and what are you about?
Hi. What am I about? I guess I'm about Appalachia and I'm about plants and I'm about traditional witchcraft. Those three things, I think.
Yeah. Well, so if people don't know what Appalachia is, let's start with that because maybe not everybody does.
That's so interesting, and I love that you all are up in Canada, so it's really cool to know you don't know what Appalachia is.
I mean, I think people I do, but yeah. let's make sure nobody has to go Google anything mid-podcast.
That's such a good idea. Yeah, Appalachia is a region which is debated. It's cultural and ecological in the eastern side of the United States. It's a mountain range that extends from, culturally, I would say, western Pennsylvania through northern Georgia, but mountain-wise and ecologically through a few different regions on the Eastern Seaboard, kind of inland. So it's a big mountain range, the Appalachian Mountains. Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of spiritual tradition that's kind of from that area, right? Like a lot of sort of more folk magic and, those kinds of approaches, right?
Yeah, that's one of the things that I am a student of and teach is Appalachian folk magic. And I'm very passionate about, and especially where plants and plant lore come into that story.
Mm-hmm. So did you grow up with that, or did you find your way into it? Like, how did that come about for you?
That's a good question. I did not grow up with it. I grew up on a farm in New Jersey.
Okay.
Yeah. And halfway in both states. And it's funny because when I tell people I'm from New Jersey, they're like, "Oh, you don't seem like you're from New Jersey at all." And I'm like, "Are you saying like I'm not an asshole? Like what? What are you saying?" I don't know if I'm allowed to say that on the air. But
I'm sorry to everybody in New Jersey who's listening to this.
Yeah. Well, I'm sorry because I had a beautiful upbringing in a very pretty little country spot in central New Jersey. Mm-hmm. And, I loved our little farm, but we didn't raise plants. We just raised animals.
Okay.
But I've always loved, I feel like since I was a little girl, I wanted to be a witch. It was just something I've always been interested in. And I was raised in the Unitarian Universalist church. So I met a lot of witches and it was easy to start studying witchcraft seriously. At around 12, I kind of dedicated myself to studying it. And through that became more interested in plants and, realizing that they could be used for more than food.
Mm-hmm. And so how did the Appalachian part come in? Like, did you meet somebody? Did you go stand on a mountain and be like, "Oh, this is home"? Like,
That's a good question. I was obviously a very weird kid, as most of us probably were,
Sure.
and very socially isolated. We moved 9 times when I was a kid, so I didn't have strong connections with other human adults until I was 18. When I moved to upstate New York to go to college at Bard College, and I met my now best friend, Sarah Lynch Thomason, who's an Appalachian ballad singer, who's from Nashville, Tennessee. And she moved to Asheville right after we graduated from college. She graduated ahead of me. And she was like, you have to move here. Asheville, North Carolina. Like, it is what's up. So I just packed my truck with all my things and drove to Asheville. And after I graduated from college, and I just lived in her living room for 2 weeks.
Right.
And then I just fell in love. I tried to leave once, I think, to go back up to Vermont where I had been living before. And I think that lasted like 3 weeks, and I came back. So that was in 2010 when I moved here. So I've been here for longer now than anywhere I've ever lived in my life.
It's interesting how, like I think about, Vermont's got lots of mountains. Upstate New York's got lots of mountains. It's funny how, from a geologic point of view anyway, there's this like, oh, look, well, it's all mountains. What is it about those mountains? What is it about that place that drew you in or captivated you?
Such a good question. Well, I think geologically speaking, the Appalachians are so special because they're some of the oldest mountains in the world, which we forget in America. We often like to exoticize, and I'll say North America to include all of us on this continent, we like to exoticize things from far away, but we have some of the most ancient land masses in existence, right at our fingertips, and it's pretty incredible. And plant communities that are very unique. And to me, the extreme biodiversity of where we live in southern Appalachia, where I live, is temperate rainforest. So we have more plants than anywhere except for North Alabama, which has the most diverse plant life in the United States.
That's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
And do you feel like, lots of people talk about sort of spirit of place, right? As a thing that's sort of emerged into people's awareness more over time. And, at least more recently from my perspective. Do you feel that that's part of it for you? Like, is there a spirit of the land where you're actually hanging out that's part of your life?
Yes. My friend, Marcus McCoy, who started the Virtus Genii Symposium when I was in my early 20s. You probably know him. When I was in my early 20s, I stumbled across his blog, Bioregional Animism, and it really changed. It gave me words for things that I had felt but I didn't know were names for. And other bloggers have now gone on to further that idea, which was, kind of coined, I'd say, in the 70s with the rise of bioregional scholarship on just like policy and land management. They took it deeper, I wrote a lot of my thesis. I have a master's degree in Appalachian studies, and I wrote my thesis on, which is really silly, I know, but I looked a lot at like the history of bioregionalism and like what makes Appalachia and regional studies important. Mm-hmm. And to me, in this globalized world, we struggle for meaning. You can see it everywhere, especially white folks, like without any cultural, strong cultural ties. We'll grab onto any strong cultural tie from any culture that we can find. Sure. And I think a lot of that comes from a lack of grounding in place. So to me, I do think there is a spirit of Appalachia. My friend Byron Ballard, who's a well-known Appalachian folk practitioner, she, in our area, says there's a Mother Appalachia, this kind of entity that makes this place so special. And to me, I'm also a musician, I'm an artist, and all the things I do revolve around Appalachian folk practice. And to me, it's like, help me ground in, because I wasn't raised here, into the life way, and the art way and the music way of this place, and not necessarily say, this is mine, it's from me, but wow, I participate in this and I love it and I want to, support it and continue it and nurture it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think it's always interesting when people, or never mind people, for me, I found my way into being a Lukumi, Orisha practitioner, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm initiated in an Afro-Cuban religion, and that's been my journey for, getting towards being 20 years now. But I think that it's really always interesting when people are looking for that meaning and they find it somewhere else. How do you go about exploring that and connecting with that in a way that is, respectful, meaningful in a broader context? Because I think that, what people do in general, even if it's not respectful, might be meaningful to them personally, but it problematically culturally, right? But what do you think about how would you recommend people approach this kind of stuff if what you're talking about is something that they're drawn towards?
Yeah, I think that's such a good question. And it's a sensitive one. I always notice, that I feel fear and I feel nervousness when talking about these things because unfortunately the way that people communicate online is very different than how they'll communicate in real life. Discovered. I just taught a class. This is a great example, and I think it'll answer this question on the uses of fumitory plants worldwide to address cultural appropriation issues.
Sure.
Because specifically with white sage being over-harvested and a lot of indigenous Western folks saying, hey, can you guys slow your roll on this, buying all this unsustainably harvested sage? Mm-hmm. So why do you feel the need to burn this plant specifically when it's not part of your cultural lineage? And I don't think anyone at this point in the world is you can't do anything that's not from your specific ancestry. Because I have 8 different ancestries, and it's
sure. Yeah.
Most of them do. And I think that's not what people are saying. And a lot of folks get defensive and say, well, what am I not allowed to do anything? And it's no, calm down. No one's telling you that. And I think what you're doing when you're initiated in something, your initiation is an invitation. Mm-hmm. You are studying with a person from that, the Afro-Cuban lineage who's saying, you're welcome here, come into this space. That's very different than when someone says, I'm going to self-study this thing and then declare myself an expert and then make money off this thing and never see the cultures that this thing comes from.
For sure.
Yeah, because what I do, I'm not technically Southern Appalachian, but I practice and teach Appalachian folk magic. Yeah. And some people, I'm sure, would take issue with that. But what do? And I think it's all about how we raise up the cultures that we are benefiting from. Mm-hmm. How do we support them? How do we not try to speak for them and do the white savior thing? And how do we invest ourselves in the continuance and preservation and nurturance of the cultures that bring us such joy and meaning? And I include myself in that, even though technically Appalachian folk culture is largely based on some things I have cultural access to. It's also based in Cherokee and African traditions that
for sure
have direct lineage to, that I need to respect and call attention to.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing about a lot of those, Appalachian, root work, hoodoo, a lot of those sort of, from there heading further south traditions are really such an interesting meld of, of cultures, right? They involve stuff that came from Africa through the slaves. They involve stuff that came through the indigenous communities that were there alongside those people, and then they have mixed in, depending on the region, European, Christian, or other folk traditions too, right? It's such an interesting meld, and I think that it's so helpful to really respect the fact that they come from a bunch of different places. They come from all those lineages, Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, because it's easy to it's easy to be well, this is just this person's thing, or this is that person's. They're diverse, and their strength comes from that history, right?
It's true. It's true. And it's great talking to my friends who are hoodoo practitioners, and saying, the first time I met my friend, Demetrius, who I don't know if you know, from New Orleans at Virtus Genii Symposium, we were kind of doing a comparison, what do you do this in hoodoo? And he's like, well, do you do this in Appalachian folk magic? And it was just such overlap that we were of course these things are so similar. Mm-hmm. It's wonderful. And then we were let's sing a Scottish ballad, and because he knows a lot of ballads. And then let's, he's like, do you want to learn this song in this West African language? And I was like, oh, heck yeah. It was really cool because it was living that experience of seeing the lines by sharing verbally those things in song and in tradition and looking at different charms we were talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And I loved that. It was really special. And what you're saying too is we tell stories about traditions being all one thing. And there's one thing I learned as I get older, I'm 31, I'm not terribly wise, but I notice things are always more complicated and beautifully complex than we think they are.
Mm-hmm.
They're never black or white. It's just complex.
For sure. Yeah. Yeah, and I think that one of the other things I want to circle back to, is you mentioned, briefly about like sustainability and stuff like that. And I think that is also such an important part of the equation of what we're talking about here too, right? Like, if you're going to live in, in connection with plants and connection with the spirits of a place or whatever, right? I think that attention on making sure that it's sustainable, making sure that there's some left, like, in my tradition, we use a lot of plants, and, some of them do grow up here. Some of them I grow myself inside, and some of them are just not possible in the far, far north where I practice, but you do what you can. But, one of the things that my elders always stress is, you never take it all. You always leave enough that it keeps going, right? You always want to make sure that whatever you're working with, that, later on it'll have regrown, or next season it will regrow or whatever, because there is this eye towards, this is a thing forever, hopefully, and therefore we want to keep that going forever,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I teach foraging classes as my day job.
Yeah.
That's what I do for a living. And this year I'm actually going to teach foraging at the University of North Carolina as
Amazing.
A college course. I know. I feel so honored. It's one nice thing about having an Appalachian Studies Master's is now I can teach at colleges. And that's, yeah, I'm really excited to get to teach at UNCA and teaching foraging. And you're speaking about sustainability. And there's a lot of interesting, confusing, complex arguments about wildcrafting in the United States, especially, and in Canada, and any place that is colonized indigenous land. And what, as settler folks who are European ancestry, like, what are our responsibilities to be good wildcrafters? Some people say you shouldn't wildcraft at all. 0% is sustainable. Others say you can just take indiscriminately and do whatever you want. But obviously, I think the truth, there's no such thing as truth, but I think a more balanced view is somewhere in between. And something I've been really interested in and enjoying doing is, there's a lot of plants we call invasive, and some of them radically alter their landscape, like one of my favorite plants, kudzu, which on Gordon White's podcast, I mentioned I like kudzu, and you would not believe the angry humans on those comments. I would. I did not say we should go plant kudzu. I did not say, like, throw its seeds everywhere. I just said, I love kudzu. And that triggered a lot of people because it's edible, it's medicinal. And I'm in recovery from alcoholism, and kudzu's root has some great compounds in it that specifically help with the cravings for alcohol. So it's one spiritually very aligned with my heart and my personal journey. So, and it was used in Japan and China for that purpose for a long time. But it's just funny because I can harvest as much kudzu as I want, and, like, I'm not going to put a dent in it. But, I mean, if I want to harvest as much bloodroot, a native plant, as I want, I can destroy that plant population. So it's just so, to me, saying all or nothing is never the right answer, because harvesting invasives is actually beneficial to the environment because it frees up space for more native plants.
Yeah. I love dandelion.
Me too.
And, it's, there's another one, like, there's just, I could never get rid of it in my garden, even if I tried, probably. So the amount that I can take of that is basically everything that's showing anytime I want. And it just, give it 2 or 3 weeks and boom, they're back again with another crop, So, yeah.
And those plants have followed us from Europe here and from Asia and from all the different places that all the different people that live on this continent now come from. And it's the story of the colonization of this continent is evident in our plant life. And it marks the times that all the different people have come over here, and all the different trading has occurred. Kudzu came over, I think, in the 30s and 40s from the World's Fair, as an erosion control plant and a crop for animals to eat because it's very good for horses and cows and pigs and chickens and people to eat. It's high in protein. So I just think, focusing on harvesting invasive plants and plants that are abundant is a great way to ask the question, is this sustainable? And also know that you will never know the answer. A lot of people in plant world are like, I know the truth. And you're like, you do? That's okay. I see you're very confident in yourself because we're just finding new things out. And ecology is just like folk magic or any spiritual tradition, always changing.
For sure. And also, with climate change.
Oh, yeah.
Like, I think that's another thing that comes into this where it's like we might have an idea based on, our experiences or our lifetime or, maybe even like our parents' or grandparents' lifetime. But things are changing a lot now. And, that's going to change what all these plants do, and also, all these, continuously there are new plants being introduced and shifting back and forth and all that kind of stuff, right? So it's such a dynamic system. Dynamic
is such a good word to describe it. And I think, once again, it's so funny. Like, I even feel fear saying, like, invasive plants, harvest them. Because, it's like, it's tough. People have very strong opinions about how plants are to be managed. And a lot of very good and important hard questions come up around that. But the thing is, we do need to eat and heal ourselves from illness. Yeah. Most of those things can be done with a lot of the invasive plants. And that's not to say I never harvest native plants. Like, I use poke a lot, which is a native plant. But most people think it's a noxious weed. They'll say, oh, that's a weed.
Sure.
It's not. It's a native plant. It's, it's just funny that people are like, oh, this horrible weed. And I'm like, what are you talking about?
Well, it's true. It's like, so a bunch of the plants that grow around here that I use often in my religious practice, purslane, stuff like that. You just find them growing out of the sidewalk, right? Like in the city, it's, you go down the back lane way and you're like, oh, look, here's this one and that one. And, and they're just growing up between cracks in the cement and wherever, because those really hardy, aggressive plants, one, they have a lot of strength magically, in a general way, I think, but two, they, they're everywhere. And again, they're the kinds of things where it's like, you don't take it all, but also even if you did, they're so resilient. Like, people are trying to get rid of them all the time and they cannot, so yeah, it's very interesting.
Yeah, and that's a great way, too, to find places to forage. I talk to a lot of farmer friends, and I'll say, I love dandelion root for its liver medicine. And it definitely is, as a plant, I feel is aligned with the element of air. It's very good for spirit work and communication, but also not toxic, so you can use it with impunity in some ways. Mm-hmm. I can call my friends and say, hey, do you mind if I bring my apprentices and our trowels out and we'll dig some dandelion at your house? And they're always like, oh, come on over, or can you come get one? And they're like, oh, come on over. So we go to different farms and kind of weed them. Mm-hmm. And then we go home with all the things that we want. It's a great symbiotic relationship.
Mm-hmm, for sure. Yeah, I have so raised beds in my garden. And then the rest of it is this sort of crummy, hard pack, dirt that's whatever was like, when they built it, they filled in because they were over a parking garage, right? And it's all the stuff that grows there is all wonderful energetically, and dandelion and plantain and like all that kind of stuff. It's like we just grow it in the yard, and my kids are like, they'll go out and pick a bunch and come back and make salad out of it and all that kind of stuff, because it's there and it's useful if you know what you're looking at, right?
Kids are so good at learning plants. I teach a lot of children. People bring their kids on our foraging tours, and they always, at the end of the tour, can recite every plant we met. And the parents are like, oh, what was that one? And the kids are like, it's hairy bittercress. And I'm like, oh, good job.
Yeah.
They know everything. They'll remember all the uses. Mm-hmm. It's so good.
That's amazing. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious, because you've mentioned this a couple times now, is this sort of, you've said, I'm afraid to talk about this. Mm-hmm. I'm afraid to talk about that.
Yeah.
Tell me about the reservation. Like, what is it that you run into around that?
Well, I think a lot of it come up recently for me with my fumitory herbs class. I got a lot of really mean, aggressive, and I would even say violent, communications around me daring to suggest to folks of non-North American indigenous ancestry that maybe they shouldn't burn white sage with impunity. And I think I tried to say it as compassionately and patiently as I could. I tried not to use attacking language. I called my own self and my own shortcomings into the conversation because I make mistakes constantly. I don't know the right answers. I'm just guessing. I'm just trying, Yeah. And the venom with which strangers will write to me is horrific. And it's funny because you see this over and over again on internet communications, because when I taught my class in person, I was terrified that people would yell at me, be fighting in the class. Like I was afraid it would be really bad. I had probably 40 people show up to this class. It was incredible. People were compassionate and patient. Nobody got a millimeter out of line. Yeah. And I was just like, I thought that was the case, but I'm so glad to see this is true. And everybody was just building together, asking questions. Even if someone didn't understand something, no one was like, well, you're an idiot for not understanding this complicated concept. And I just appreciated how kind people were to each other. And I see that that's the case, But online, when you're anonymous.
Definitely. Yeah.
And that's where fear comes from for me, because I just see other herbalists, and I'm often holding myself back in my work, I think, because I'm terrified to make mistakes and hurt people. Mm-hmm. It also prevents me from sharing more information or, providing access to education to more folks that want it.
Yeah, I totally get that,
Feel that way?
Last fall, I had made an Orisha tarot deck that got published through Llewellyn, and so it's basically everywhere, and which is great. And the amount of apprehension I had about being an outsider, about even with the blessings of my ancestors, or like my elders, my ancestors, the spirits through divination, like even with all those things, there's just like, oh man, like waiting for that potential thing, right? And sometimes you get it and sometimes you don't, right? And definitely online is a place where it's way more likely, because online people, be kind, people, just be kind. I'm sure nobody listening to this podcast is mean online, but yeah, but that apprehension, right? And then also that realization, now that it's out there, that how much people are benefiting from it, and how much people are, telling me how grateful they are that I made this offering, to the world and whatever. And I think that it's such a delicate line for us, for people doing work, for people offering teaching, and that there's so many people out there who are just like, rah, 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 do your thing, screw everybody, give no fucks, whatever. And I'm always like, that's horrible. Like, let's not be like that. That's not useful.
Yeah.
But then also there's like so many people doing good work, like, what you're up to, where there's also that like, oh, should I? How's it going to go? What's going to happen? I don't know, Yeah. And it's, and it's real, that tension is really real. And I think that so many people experience it around their work and stuff, How do you find your way through it?
I think a lot of it is I try to use, like, I am an incredibly privileged person, I'm a largely able-bodied, white, tall, physically able person. Who can appear heterosexual in certain situations, and and feminine, and it's, so I can use those things to leverage, messages and voices that are erased and largely unheard in my friends' communities, especially my indigenous friends. And I do a lot of work with the Catawba Indian Nation, and I'm hoping to do some more with the Cherokee Nation around ethnobotany and re-establishing control over the knowledge of foraging to the people who taught it to my ancestors here. And I think it's kind of crazy that me, as a European ancestored person, am going and teaching indigenous people how to forage, because their own knowledge was erased from them through genocide. And it's, to me, like, acknowledging those things, and like when we come together as people in the real world, in real life together, me and my friends in those nations, we can create pretty amazing things. And we talk about really hard, uncomfortable, scary stuff. And it's tough. You know, it's hard. It brings up a lot for both of us.
Mm-hmm.
But instead of allowing it to paralyze us and prevent us, we're like, what can we build from this space? Like, where do we go forward? Let's acknowledge these things, talk about the hard stuff, the history, the harm caused by my ancestors, and let's build something new from that, you know? Mm-hmm. And I think that's really tough, is because we don't know what to do. None of us really know. And for me, like, constantly giving word, voice, accolade, and when I have extra resources, putting my resources towards the people whose land this was and is still. That to me is what I can do. And I know that's not what everyone would say is the best way. But for me, I know I don't, unfortunately, being a Appalachian folk magical practitioner is definitely not a great way to make a lot of money. I don't have a ton of resources and I have a lot of debt. So, but I have a lot of non-monetary resources, like access to academic information. So I do a lot of research for my friends who don't have access to journals. And I give them my, university, don't tell my university, I give them my login.
Nobody from university is listening, it's fine.
No, they're not, don't worry. But just finding ways to constantly figure out, like, okay, who am I speaking for? How can I help make space for others to speak? And how can I make my resources available to them that are most helpful? And not what I think is most helpful, but what they need.
Yeah, I think that part about asking people what they need, I mean, I think it's such a piece that gets overlooked so often in any kind of restorative approach.
Yes.
Right? That, like, say you're sorry, like whatever it was, personal thing, a generational thing or whatever, say, hey, I'm really sorry this happened. And then ask, like, is there something you need? Is there something that you think that I might be able to do that you need? And then you can really see where the conversation goes, right? Because I find so often people make these apologies or, I mean, again, maybe I'm being judgmental about people who are raging against you about using white sage online. But I'm like, listen, just start with an apology or just start with saying, well, what could I do instead? What might make sense, And maybe there are people, and probably there are people who 100% like have a deep, deep connection to that plant, or, like the white sage plant, or there are lots of ways in which you can procure stuff sustainably if you want to, like, I got some stuff here. There's a new farmer in Ontario who started growing stuff. We got laid off from his job and he just, started expanding what he was already farming for himself. And it's great. It's local, it's organic, it's sustainably harvested because he's farming it himself. Right. It's great. Right. So like there's lots of options, but being mad about it, that's not like, that doesn't help anybody. And
yeah, they don't like being told they can't do something.
Right?
People are mad at me for saying, and I didn't say that. I said, hey, maybe listen to indigenous people.
Yeah.
And 2, look at how this plant is now entering threatened status. Like, these are 2 things that are very important for different reasons.
Yeah. And I think too, I mean, it's always something that's very interesting to me because my approach to working with plants outside of my traditional stuff, which I learned from my elders, is I go for walks in the ravine, or in the forest in the valley here, or even in the laneways. And when I find a plant, like something will grab my attention and I'll be like, what are you? What's going on? And I'll just sit down and hang out with it for a while.
Yeah. And,
none of those plants are mad. I've yet to find an angry plant, I mean, like that kind of like conflicty energy, even plants that are in competition with each other or whatever, I never have that feeling from them that they have that aggressiveness, and I think that it's an interesting thing to sort of ask yourself when you're working with plants, like, what is the energy of this plant and how am I aligned with it and how are my feelings aligned with it and what's going on from there, I don't know. Does that make any sense to you?
Oh, definitely. And I think I totally agree with you. And I was talking to a friend the other day and he's like, how do we separate the spiritual from the political? And I was like, I don't think we can. and I don't think we should at this point. But I think I see why people want to. They say, oh, can we just leave politics out of it?
Sure.
Like, well, that would be great, but unfortunately, with the way things are, we can't. And there's, a lot of internet explosions around things like that. Mm-hmm. Because people are like, well, you don't bring up politics at this event. And it's like, well, you can't talk about plants or harvesting or medicine or magic and not talk about the people it's come from, how we know about it.
Yeah.
And the story of how we've got to this point. And we need to do better as a community, especially, in the white herbal world, and white practitioners need to do better about being open to like talking about hard stuff and realizing it doesn't mean they have to fling themselves off a cliff.
For sure, right?
I think sometimes people think that's what people are asking of them, and it's like, no one is asking you to fling yourself off a cliff. Maybe some people are, but you don't have to do that. And it's just about being able to say like, whoa, what's the real story of how I got this information?
Yeah.
And, the real story of when I harvest poke, I know what poke's medicinal uses are because indigenous and African folks told my ancestors those things.
Yeah.
So I need to, every time I work with that plant, I think about that. And I don't think about it in a negative or combative way. I think, like you're saying, I think about it in a, like, thank you, gratitude.
Yeah.
A building.
Yeah, I don't think we can ever separate. I don't think we can really ever separate, or ought to, as you say at this time, separate politics from our spirituality. I think that makes no sense at all to me. And even historically, you look at a lot of, like the stories of the Orishas going back, so many of them demarcate political shifts in power and other kinds of things that are historical. This group came in, they took over this region, they deposed the kind of person who was in charge, and the spirit that person, was most aligned with got a new story where they got demoted somehow because of something, right? Or what have you. There's a lot of that. And it's why when I wrote the book that goes with my deck, I included a bunch of politics all through it, and even a chapter in the front that's the header is like, why are there politics in this book? And and it's like there's a few pages on like why I wanted to really make sure I was engaging and honoring some of that political content, because it's true of the religion, it's true of the world, and it's true for people who are living in the world and using these tools or these plants or whatever. We're all running into politics all the time, and so the idea that we could free ourselves from that somehow is, I don't know, reminds me very much of like the Golden Dawn notion of like, we'll get back to like the one true history behind all of the movement of the last, thousands of years since Egypt, and we'll, access pure spiritual being and whatever. It's like, no, that doesn't exist,
I think you're so right. That was really well said, and I totally agree. And it's to me like, I don't want to shame like when I hang out with a lot of hippies in Asheville, and they're like, we're one human family. I'm like, we are. You're right, and it's great. We're all humans. We have these shared human experiences, but within that human experience, my experience is very different than my friend who's Latinx or a person of color or disabled or differently abled or blind or deaf, or like anybody that experiences the world and unfortunately the baggage that the world puts upon them and our culture, the different reasons and the different oppressions that people experience. I don't understand for me it's difficult to understand when people are like, let's just pretend those things don't exist, because it's hard.
Sure.
To deal with, and it's hard when you don't experience a lot of those things to be compassionate enough to say, what would it be like? How can I put myself in that person's shoes and be compassionate to them and be like, wow, you have had it way more difficult than me. And that doesn't mean that, once again, I need to jump off a cliff, but it means I need to be aware of how I move through the world and who I'm stepping on, who I'm profiting off of, and who I'm supporting in the way that they would like to be supported, not the way I think they should be supported. And like I said, I always tell my students, like, I don't know the answers. I have no idea what I'm talking about. I do have some idea, but I'm guessing, and I'm trying to listen to my friends and what their needs actually are. And I make mistakes, and I have to say sorry, like you said, and then ask, what word did you use? Not reconstructed, but used a great word to kind of describe that, asking somebody, what can I do? What do you need from me? To true apology.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I can't remember right now, but you can rewind and listen to it later.
Yeah. Well, that word, and that concept of that to me is so integral in our work, especially with plants. It's so complicated. And like I said, many people will either say, right on, or say, wow, she's a crazy communist, or wow, she's actually horrible and she shouldn't harvest any plants at all. And I know at some point I want everyone to like me. I want everyone. I'm a very people-pleasing person, being socialized female growing up. I always want to make everyone happy and feel safe. Also quadruple cancer here.
Wow. It's a lot of cancer. It's a lot of cancer. The struggle is real, eh?
That's a real struggle.
Yeah.
But a lot of fire, too. So it's hard to find out what to truly do about that. But I think what you've said, and the way you handled your book, people will be mad at us no matter what we do in life and dislike us, and that's okay.
Yeah.
Looking for places where we're causing real harm, that's to me more important than dealing with people who are on the internet screaming for no real purpose.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, people can do whatever they want on the internet. It's fine. It's the internet. I mean, it would be great if people were kinder, but it's the internet. So it's the modern monster we've created, right? Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. I've been, so I guess I have a question for you, and then maybe we'll wrap up, because we've been on the phone for a while here, which has been super fun, and we could probably talk for a long time. But so my question is, if you were to pick a plant, or maybe a couple plants, that you think their energy harmonizes with kind of what we've been talking about here, what plant would that be for you, for somebody to get to know, on an energetic level or whatever level makes sense,
Yeah, that's such a good question. I think for me, one of my most patron plants is mugwort, Artemisia vulgaris. And most gardeners in my town will be like, I hate mugwort because it has running rootlets and it goes all over the place and it's a weed. But mugwort has been used historically all over the world as a banishing herb. The way that many New Age folks use white sage now, which is not really its intended purpose, is what I've been told by different folks. And you can read a lot more about that by actual indigenous people online. If you want to look up the original uses of white sage, I encourage you to do that. But mugwort, whether burned or even just hung up as a bundle, was used to keep away evil, to cleanse a space, to remove disease-causing spirits, and in Asia as well as North America and Europe. And now it's naturalized. It's not native. It's naturalized all over the United States in lots of different species. And they're fragrant. They're edible, medicinal, important plants. And I invite you to meet mugwort. And especially if you have German ancestry, it was one of the most important fumitory plants of the German folks, which my last name means from Bavaria. So as you can imagine, that's some of the stuff I focus on in my work. But I invite people to meet mugwort, because when you harvest it, you're weeding out an invasive plant. You can make all types of food and medicine. And I have a post on my blog about the history of its magical uses if people are curious about it.
We'll include a link in the show notes for sure. That's awesome. Yeah. Mugwort's a really great one. It's funny. It's amusing. I don't know. I don't even know what the right word is. I'm always surprised at how hard a sell it is to people sometimes, when other things is just such an easy sell, right? You know? But now I'm just going to be like, look, Rebecca says you should use this one. I'm going to put a little sign above the, with your face saying, get this one, where we sell it in the shop. Yeah. The one that I leaned on a lot through the kind of journeys with this stuff was dandelion, and to sort of partly because of its notion of that deep taproot as sort of staying deeply grounded in my own practice and being really, really grounded in what I do. Partly, because of the even though people see it as a weed, the beauty of its flower, right? That sort of offering of a radiance to the world through what I'm trying to do with my work. And also because it's, often used for detoxifying and stuff like that. That sort of inner cleanse. It's I got to root out this stuff that's conditioning and cultural baggage and other things so that I can be more authentic to myself and what I need to be doing, So that was definitely one that I leaned down a lot. Last year, especially through the summertime, whenever I was like feeling that worry about what was going to happen when the thing came out, I was like, all right, let's go out in the garden, dig up some dandelions, make some tea, or like hang out with them, or put a bunch of them on the table for a while, or whatever,
Yeah.
So yeah, for sure.
That's amazing. I love that. Thanks for sharing that with me.
Yeah. So for people who want to check out what you're up to, and people should definitely check out what you're up to, where do they find you? What are you up to, and where are you hanging out online right now?
Where do I lurk? Well, I have a website and an Instagram account called Blood and Spicebush, and my website is bloodandspicebush.com. Spicebush is one of my favorite native plants. And a blood cleanser, hence the name of my website. And I also run a small folk herbalism school with my friend Abby Artemisia called Sassafras School, and you can find us at sassafras-school.com. And we have a few more spaces left in our year-long program on folk medicine and wild foods, as we're both female botanists and foragers and medicinal practitioners. So we're excited to share that because there's lots of amazing clinical herb programs, but we've seen there wasn't really any folk programs. So we decided to give it a go and see how that goes.
Nice. That's awesome. Amazing. And you're going to be in Hamilton this summer for folks who are local to the shop. So, we'll put a link in for where you can find that as well in the notes. But, Rebecca's going to be up in our part of the world a little bit where the shop is. So
End of June. Yeah.
End of June. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being on. It's been a wonderful chatting with you.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, as always, for listening. Thank you for spreading the word. Thank you for supporting the Patreon. Thanks for being a reason why this happens. That's it. All you get is my gratitude at the end here. I'll be back soon with a whole bunch of new episodes. Starting in February, we should be back on a bi-weekly schedule.